continuing to take some presentations that I've done in the past few years and record them as videos, just so they're available whenever anyone needs to reference them. So for today's instalment, let's visit a subject that I presented on a number of times in the past: how to manage Microsoft OneDrive in virtual environments. So it was only a matter of time before I got to this subject, because more and more of us are adapting to new ways of working, and OneDrive is bound to come to your attention, right? If you've been living under a rock, OneDrive is Microsoft's horse in the Enterprise File Share and Sync, the EFSS race. And because it's free with your Office 365 entitlement, it's pretty much one of the front runners. Like ShareFile, Box, Dropbox, a lot of those have more features and work better. But if your product's effectively free, then there's a tipping point of good enough, and Microsoft have already passed this threshold with OneDrive. I started with OneDrive for Business, and it was very flaky, and so I ended up going back to Dropbox for Business for a bit. But then, as I said, Dropbox is still better. Microsoft have polished OneDrive enough so that it no longer makes sense for me to pay extra for Dropbox. So there's no point going into the sort of conversation about what works best on Citrix virtual apps and desktops. The chances are you've already been told to look at OneDrive. And as with Teams, Microsoft can be quite savvy by pushing this hard, pushing this product hard into the personal user space, and then allowing the users themselves to pressure the enterprises into adoption because they're already familiar with it. But when it comes to putting OneDrive into Citrix or other virtualized environments like Azure Virtual Desktop, etc., and particularly shared multi-user environments where you run on RDSH, there are a number of factors that you want to bear in mind. Firstly is storage, right? OneDrive offers users up to, well, it was originally up to 1 terabyte, but now it can even be unlimited storage, so potentially even more. Now, obviously, all your users are not going to use all the storage, but it's a huge amount of storage to potentially fill. Now, OneDrive generally requires you to use what's called the OneDrive Sync client, which has a local cache of your OneDrive data. Now, the local cache can occupy as much data as the user is potentially using within OneDrive, so it can be a sizable amount. So it's very important, firstly, to know how much storage your average user will need, right? So you need to do some monitoring. And secondly, there's a question of security, right? OneDrive can only sync to the C drive. You can kind of try and send it to other places, but it doesn't work particularly well. And when you start talking about physical devices with small SSD drives and things like that, it becomes a bit of a problem. But in a virtual environment, and particularly shared remote desktop session host systems, it becomes even more of an issue, right? You can't use a network drive, you can't use a junction point, you can't use FSLogix or some subst trickery to redirect the OneDrive cache somewhere else. You can't fool with it, right? And if you're in the habit of applying CIS hardening policies, again, especially on multi-user systems, it's common practice to restrict access to the system drive, which is embedded in the C drive, right? And this means that in these environments, using the sync client becomes really difficult because the user literally can't access their files, right? I remember raising this with Microsoft, and they told us to get stuffed, which was rather disappointing and an attitude that I hope they change. But, we haven't heard anything more on that. Thirdly, you've got the OneDrive client itself. As with Teams, Microsoft prefer to keep this updated and installed on a per-user basis so they can deliver new features quickly and effectively. For Citrix and RDSH environments where you want admin control of your estate, that gives you a few problems as well. And finally, there's the problem of FSLogix, and I know that's a word it sounds a bit weird calling it a problem, right? Because FSLogix is probably, one of the best ways to deal with synchronization of the OneDrive cache. But it is categorically flagged in the documentation that OneDrive does not support multiple simultaneous connections or multiple concurrent connections using the same profile under any circumstance. That is what it says. So if you've got users who have multiple connections to OneDrive in multiple sessions, right, you're going to get into a file conflict nightmare as it tries to synchronize between these sessions. So it's important to think about this and all the other things I mentioned. And we also have to think about with FSLogix as well is, will FSLogix get much more future development now that it's owned by Microsoft? Because it was bought to fill a gap, mainly a profile-sized gap. And when it was, its own company, when it's FSLogix, you'd expect them to address stuff like this. But now it's owned by Microsoft. Will it get the same sort of time on the development phase? That's another question you maybe need to ask yourself. I'm not going to dwell too much on the actual installation of the OneDrive Sync client. There's a couple of things you need to remember. Obviously, this part of the presentation assumes you actually wanted to use the sync client. If some of the options we're going to discuss don't use the sync client, so you wouldn't need to worry about this bit. Firstly, you need to get the machine installer, which like Teams installs it in the program files folder instead of the user profile. So you need to run it with the necessary switch, the all user switch, right? I also consider it best practice to, like Teams, remove the auto-run entries for the machine so that the user can choose when they want to invoke OneDrive from the start menu, and after that, it then runs automatically. So that ensures that thousands of users don't all start synchronizing at once when you deploy it. The auto-run entry for OneDrive is a little tricky to find. It's actually written into the default user profile area of the registry. So you have to open the registry, highlight the HK users hide, choose load hide, enter the path to the default user registry file, and find it in HK user, whatever name you picked for the hide, you load it in there, software, Microsoft, Windows, current version, run once. Delete it from there, and then obviously don't forget to unload that hide afterwards. And that's kind of all you need to do for installation. Make sure you install the correct switch, remove the auto start entry to terrain control, but you also need to make sure that you update the installation through your image management process, right? Best way to do it is evergreen, but that's a completely different subject, so just make sure you keep it up to date. So, what are our options for dealing with OneDrive on Citrix or other virtual platforms? Right now, the way Microsoft would ideally recommend that you do it is, to offer the richest user experience, is to use the sync client, FSLogix, and group policy. However, for reasons we'll discuss, this may not be suitable or even desirable for some environments. So to do this, obviously, firstly, you'd install the sync client for all of your users, like we just discussed. Ideally, this will work with single sign-on, although depending on your sort of requirements, you may or may not be able to do this. Then you need to install either the full FSLogix profile container, or if you're using another profile management piece, install FSLogix Office 365 container and set the include OneDrive option via GPO on the registry. Installing FSLogix means that the local cache of the user's OneDrive files goes into the network-mounted container rather than on the local disk, right? So you've still got a storage overhead, but it's on a network share instead of your local drives, and it then persists from session to session without re-caching, right? You should then configure OneDrive files on demand via GPO, which means that files won't be downloaded at the user's local cache until they're actually accessed by the user. Now, architectural limitations mean you can only use files on demand if you're using Windows Server 2019 or an upstream version of Windows 10 or Windows 10 multi-user. If you're using other OSs, particularly Server 2016, then you can't use files on demand, right? In these cases, I'd say to synchronize the entire cache into the FSLogix container with all of the storage overhead that entails, or choose one of the other options we'll discuss. Now, the GPO for files on demand is located at Computer Configuration Policies, Admin Templates, OneDrive, Use OneDrive Files on Demand. And the GPO actually says that it works on Server 2016, but that's an error, so don't get your hopes up. I'd also ideally configure a second option from this set of GPOs, which is block file downloads when users are low on disk space, which means if the server host is in a low disk space state, they won't be able to cache any more files from OneDrive until you resolve that disk space issue. You should also configure storage sense GPOs, right? This feature was originally intended to replace the disk cleanup wizard, but it has a really useful setting that can dehydrate, which essentially means delete the local copy of files that haven't been accessed for a defined period of time. If you set this aggressively, this can keep the size of the OneDrive cache down quite well. The GPOs you need are located at Computer Config Policies, Admin Templates, System, Storage Sense. And the main ones you're interested in are called Allow Storage Sense, Configure Storage Sense Cadence, and Configure Storage Sense Cloud Content Dehydration Threshold. There are a number of options you can use with Storage Sense. I've actually got an article on my blog that discusses them quite nicely. You can set the user session with all of the above configured, accessing their OneDrive folder here, right? And all of the files are shown as stored in the cloud until such a time as they are accessed. Another quick mention about Storage Sense, which is in the article that I'll link in the description of this video, is that getting it to work on Server 2019 can be a little bit tricky, but it's all covered off in the article. Now, I've just realised that this particular slide is a little bit out of date, so you can forget all about it, because it says configure FSLogix maintenance to make sure that FSLogix reclaims the space properly. You used to have to do this by running scripts, which is shown here, but now, if you look on my, not the previous video, because that's a football related video, but the one before that, which talks about configuring FSLogix compaction, that's what you need to do. So your FSLogix maintenance, you can still use the scripts if you want, right? But why would you get the latest version of FSLogix, turn the compaction on, keep down the amount of space that FSLogix is going to use in those caches. So that's option one, right? FSLogix, sync client, and group policy. What are the pros and cons? Now, on the positive side, Microsoft would recommend it this way. It's fully supported, it has no cost to set up, right? It offers the richest user experience. They have the OneDrive Access and Explorer that they're used to, and you can do all sorts of things around single sign-on, node mode move, tenant restrictions by using OneDrive GPOs. But on the flip side, it's a little bit limited. It obviously requires Server 2019 or higher if you're on RDS Edge. isn't suitable for multiple concurrent sessions. To be honest, it's pretty much aimed at desktop resource only. Because it uses a sync client, anyone with sys-hardening GPOs won't be able to use it. And there's also a problem that users can still download huge files into cache and bloat the profiles, right? Like I said, you've got to make sure those FSLogix containers do their automatic shrinkage because they aren't state only. So be careful about how much storage you're actually going to use. So there's nothing to say that that this can't be a good option for you, but as I said, there are some pain points around it that may not make it ideal, particularly for RDSH for shared user kind of sessions. Now, if you're unable to do this kind of Microsoft way for any of the reasons mentioned, you can try, and I believe me, I've actually done this, try and sling it together to access it directly using the old WebDAV protocol, which means Web Distributed Authoring Version. I know a lot of people have a visceral fear of WebDAV because they fear slow performance and Microsoft withdrawn support. But I actually put this into a customer environment a couple of years ago, and for their purposes, which were a pure published apps estate, it worked pretty much okay. The best benefit for Citrix virtual apps or other similar environments is that you create that online connection through Windows Explorer. There's no storage overhead whatsoever. But in order to do this without any third-party software, you have to do quite a bit of work. I mean, a lot of online guides simply say, just log in via the web, right? Choose the File Explorer option, map as a network location. But that's a lot of hard work for your average user to do themselves, right? So the whole idea behind this bit, option number 2, is to do it automatically and present that folder to the users. First thing you need to do is, if you're on a server OS, you need to ensure that Internet Explorer Enhanced Security Config is turned off. Then you need to enable WebDAV. On older server OSs, this was a case of just making sure that the web client service was started, but on newer server OSs, it isn't even installed by default. Windows 10 or Windows 10 Multi-User, it is installed by default. You just have to set the service to automatic. For Server 2012 and 2012 R2, you had to add the desktop experience feature to get the web client service up and running. For Server 2016, 2019, and 2022, you need to install the WebDAV redirect role either through Server Manager or through PowerShell. Once you've done that, you'll find the web client service is now installed. It should be set to automatic and be running, which you can enforce with the GPO or GPP. Then you need to find, this is where it gets tricky, you need to find the base name of your SharePoint site that hosts all of your OneDrive instances. Mine is jamesrankin-my.sharepoint.com, and it's pretty usual to find names in that format. They should all have a sharepoint.com address of some sort. So you'll need this address on a few occasions in this process, and there to know it. You need to make sure that your site address is added to the trusted site lists in your browser settings for IE, so use the GPOs to do that. You can do user or computer GPOs. Also configure some other GPOs. There is the trusted site zone, and make sure the option logon options is set to automatic logon with current username and password. You also need to make sure that pop-up blocker is turned off. That's in the same set of GPOs as for the trusted site zone. It's called use pop-up blocker, right? Enable it and switch it to disabled. And then there's also the trusted site zone. You need to configure turn on protected mode. You need to set it to enabled and then disable it, right? So a little bit of messing about with the GPOs that we've got in there. Next, you need to do a couple of bits of configuration for the web client service, right? And you can do this using a computer group policy preference to write these registry values that are shown below. This is to disable authentication for the SharePoint sites. Value sits in HKLM system current control set services web client parameters. It's a reg multi-essay called auth forward server list. You need to add values for the name.sharepoint.com address and name-my.sharepoint.com address, and add both HTTP and HTTPS entries. And also in the same key, add a dword value called support locking and set this to 0 as shown below. Now, if you log into your OneDrive through the web, right, what you need to do is have a look at the address bar in your browser and see what format the path is in, right? If you look at the highlighted section at the top there, that's from my own tenant, which is basically my Office 365 email address with the periods and the @ symbols replaced with underscores. That's what most tenants look like. Some of them have the UPN instead, so username@domain.com with underscores again instead of the periods or the @ symbols. Now, whichever it is, it's usually the email address. You need to pull this detail out of the user details and format it correctly so you can map to it. So for my tenant, we need to pull the email address from the AD user details, pass it into the format that OneDrive uses. There is an article linked to this as well, right, that shows you these bits of code that are listed here, how to run that. You need to run this at logon at least once to capture the data for the user. It's best to do it every time, really, in case the profile gets deleted. Don't forget you just need to substitute it in the SharePoint site. Have a look at the article, and when you've completed it, you'll have a script that basically sets the path to the OneDrive location as a variable, which is then available in the user session. You then need to do the real trick, which is getting the user to authenticate. Now, there are a number of ways you do this, and it generally only needs to be done once. Now, I've seen environments where they've had a OneDrive authentication published app that the users need to run, which simply presents a browser window for them to log on to SharePoint. I've also seen published desktops where they pop up a browser window at first log on for them to authenticate to. Now, obviously, there needs to be a profile management solution in place to capture these logon credentials, and identifying which users have logged on and authenticated can be a bit tricky. I preferred to use the way to have a OneDrive authentication published app. They run it. If for whatever reason their profile gets deleted and they can't access OneDrive, they just run it again, right? And the authentication now works again. Internet Explorer, rather bizarrely, is the best browser to get the authentication done, right? I know that's mad, but there you go. Point it to the root of your SharePoint site, and once the users run it, it just prompts with the password is below, and they should save their credentials. Obviously, they need to use the option to stay signed in. And if there's MFA at this point, then it will behave as normal as well. Now that you've got the authentication done and you've got the path to the folder saved the variable, you can simply map to the folder. You can do this by accessing the variable directly. You can set up a shortcut, create a network location shortcut, or even redirect their documents folder, which is often the path of the least resistance. I do like to create a special Windows folder to do this with a custom icon that matches OneDrive, as you can see in that bit on the left-hand side there. You can do this by PowerShell or even registry manipulation. That's all contained in the article as well. I haven't got time to go into it all in this presentation. Now, the only thing you have to do is, if you're doing this on an older operating system like Windows 7 or 2008 R2, Microsoft have made a lot of TLS changes. TLS 1.0 and 1.1 connections are no longer allowed to SharePoint Online, which includes OneDrive. So you need to apply a set of registry values in this situation. Again, more details, there's a link there. I'll put it in the description as well. So what are the pros and cons of this, right? Now, there are quite a lot of cons, because in some environments, user authentication, I've seen it expire after a period of time, which means security settings, zero config, proxy servers and things like that may be causing inaccessibility. There is a script out there called OneDrive Map, which runs to keep checking the authentication status, which a lot of people use. It has to run constantly though, so it looks a little bit messy, which is why I opted to do it this manual way. But if you're having problems with the authentication sticking, that might be a solution you can use. I've deployed this method a few times already. You know, that's a pain to set up. It does work effectively once set up. I've done it on very old OSs, back to Windows Server 2003, and it works well there. If you're blocking access to the C drive, this makes a lot of sense. You don't need any storage uplift at all, because you're not caching anything. But like I said, proxy server security settings can make it a little bit twitchy. And there is always that spectre that Microsoft might pull WebDAV support from OneDrive, although it's been rumored for a very long time, and it hasn't yet come to pass. However, if you wanted to go this kind of online route, but you're concerned about the hackiness or the support or the authentication issues you might get with the method we just discussed, there are some third-party possibilities you can use if you've heard it. Now let's start with one called CloudDrive. CloudDrive is a very simple yet effective product that allows users to authenticate and access a mapped drive to their OneDrive folder, right? It runs as an Azure Enterprise app, so you need to integrate it with your tenancy. Once you start the app, it's really simple to set up your requirements. You just fill them in as required. Your tenant name, you put the source, get the source files, get that license key, get it deployed out to your endpoints, right? And then you go in and configure it. You tell it which drive you want to map for the users. You know, it doesn't just do OneDrive, you do Teams drives, other SharePoint sites as well. Dead easy. Once you've got CloudDrive mapped and running, right, when the user logs in the first time, whether there's a published app or a published desktop, they'll see this prompt for authentication, essentially what we were doing with option 2, right, but it's much more slick. User bangs in their email address, it prompts for their password or MFA or both, right, you then see the drive being mapped. Now, what I like to do as well, you know, a lot of people are just quite happy to just have it mapped as a drive. Here it's shown as O. And if you want to make it neater, you can do what we discussed in option 2, which you can have it as an integrated Explorer folder with a custom icon. What I've done is, in the past, I configure a GPO that hides the drive letter of the CloudDrive map drive, and then just adds the folder through PowerShell, the same way we did earlier. Well, now CloudDrive map's handling all of that integrated authentication and the re-authentication, so it's much more seamless experience for your users. Again, there's an article linked in the description that will tell you all about that. Needless to say, CloudDrive map will work perfectly across multiple sessions, although obviously you do need to persist the user profile in order for their settings to run. People sometimes get a bit twitchy about security when you talk about things like cloud drive app. However, the data is stored in Azure, it's hashed, it's encrypted at rest and in transit, doesn't require any admin access, just needs to be registered as an enterprise app in Office 365. It conforms to all your existing privileges and permissions that the user has assigned them, and the only data held by cloud drive app themselves is the URLs, the SharePoint sites with no access and things like that, and hashed copies of the user email address. So what are the pros and cons with Cloud Drive? Works on many operating systems. I went back to Vista in 2008. It doesn't work on 2003 though. It requires .NET 4.5. How many of you got 2003 systems out there? It's a slick and fast user experience. Works well across concurrent sessions. It's easy to set up. Works perfectly with security policies. Doesn't need to re-authenticate. Doesn't need any storage. I've put on here, I told you this was no presentation, that it currently uses WebDAV. It doesn't anymore. The next version has a native API and WebDAV is removed. So no more WebDAV required, right? It does have a licensing cost, very small though. Has no support for x86 targets. The x86 installer is still available if you want to do that. And if you're running published apps, it needs the process adding the log off checks modules on Citrix to make sure it logs off gracefully. But like I said, right, some of these pros and cons are no longer valid, as I said, so forget about that bit where it says currently uses WebDAV. That is now a big green tick instead of a red X. So there's, a lot of good stuff about Cloud Drive. I find it a really cheap, effective, simple, easy solution to solving the OneDrive issue if you've got problems with using the sync client. Now you can do similar with Citrix files, formerly ShareFile, which is another option here, right? So Citrix configuration obviously requires you to be a Citrix files customer. You add the connector in for OneDrive for Business, you add the SharePoint root address, so again you can see it's similar to what we were doing with that WebDAV pack. You add the users, you add the format of the name, again, does this all sound familiar? Then you just allow it to talk to your Microsoft tenant and you're good to go. And what you'll find is, as long as you've got the Citrix files aspect of the VDA installed and your single sign-on is working, you can go straight to the Citrix files drive, which by default is S, and go into the Office 365 folder, and then have a OneDrive folder in there with all of your OneDrive stuff inside it. Pros and cons of Citrix ShareFile. Works on Windows 7, 2008, R2 and up. It's pretty straightforward to set up. Again, works well across concurrent sessions. It gets additional features into Windows Explorer, so all of the extra ShareFile stuff works perfectly with the security policies. Doesn't need you to re-authenticate. User experience is a little bit confusing because you have to go into the S drive and drill through parent folders. It has a licensing cost attached to it as well, so enterprises that don't have it, would you will to pay for it. It has a little bit of cache as well based in the profile, although not a lot, so it does need a little bit of storage overhead. There's also the option to use a product that was formerly called AppSense Data now, which is called Ivanti File Director. And this is one of the first products to address this issue. But unfortunately, I never really clicked on what they were trying to do until caching came along, right? Now, it's not a trivial setup process at all, right? Again, I've linked for the best article I found on setting up. It runs from an appliance, so it also needs a lot of work in Azure AD, setting up enterprise apps, setting up certificates. You configure your users and your mounting points on the appliance. You need the file director client and target devices. And the appliance then acts as a broker between targets and OneDrive. Like I said, it is very complicated to set up. But what it does is it obviously stacks more features beyond just this, right? With File Director, you can essentially capture folders where users are dropping stuff that maybe they shouldn't be and start syncing them off to the appliance and things like that. So it's quite a powerful set of features that it has. Once you've got the Windows client installed, right, for your users, you then access OneDrive through the native client, the web client, it autonomously syncs. And like I said, beyond this OneDrive capability, it does a massive amount of stuff. It has some awesome features. Like I said, automatically sync custom folders, which is so much better than non-folder move, right? There are lots of things in there. But like I said, we are strictly talking today about how to do OneDrive remediation, so let's not get too far to go. Like I said, File Director, if you're an Ivanti customer, probably makes a lot of sense to leverage this if you've got the entitlement to the File Director licenses. So again, for this fifth option, what are the pros and cons? Again, works on Windows 7, 2008, R2, no storage requirements, works well across concurrent sessions, loads of additional features, works with the security policies that restrict access to C drive, no re-authentication. It does require you to put an appliance in your infrastructure. It's a very complicated setup process. Obviously, it has a cost of licensing and cost of support. Documentation wasn't great, and the interface that you're presenting, again, isn't tied in to that kind of native Microsoft File Explorer experience that we're looking for. So, what conclusions can we draw from this? Let's have a look. Let's just bear in mind, hopefully I'll edit this out in the video, is that red for, oh no, I've changed it already, there you go. Cloud Drive Mapper doesn't say it requires WebDAV, that's all good. So right, there's horses for courses in all of these, right? If you already have Citrix files or Ivanti entitlements, then it would make sense to leverage their particular products, right? If you had to make it work on very old operating system versions, like 2003, then you're stuck with the WebDAV method, but hopefully there aren't too many of you out there, only about one. But if I had to make a choice, right, if I could afford the storage uplift and I was on the right OS version and I had no need for concurrent sessions and I had no need for the security block on the C drive, I'd go with the Microsoft recommended method, the sync client and FS Logic. However, that's 4 things that we're bearing in mind. If storage, if security, if concurrency, or if the OS version, or any sort of consideration, I would go with the sort of green versus red on there and go with Cloud Drive Mapper. It scores well in 7 out of the 9 parameters that we've laid down, so it's the best out of a lot of them. There is a cost, but like I said, it's not a great cost. If you want to buy Cloud Drive Mapper, just drop me a comment or drop me an email and I can put you in touch with the guys. They're very friendly. But I would say, as I said, if you can meet the requirements for it, then sync client and FS Logics. If you're on a very old operating system like 2003, you're stuck with WebDAV. If you've got Citrix files or Ivanti file directory entitlement already, then it would make sense to go with those. But if you're in a situation where you haven't got those entitlements or you don't want to pay for them, and you're restricted by security, by storage, by concurrency, then Cloud Drive Mapper is the go-to solution that you should look at. Anyway, I hope that's been useful to some people. I hope you can't hear the music that seems to be playing outside my office in the background of this video, because I can't bother to record. But anyway, stay tuned and hopefully we should have more content coming soon.